So the question I asked, and this is with my PhD student, Shobana, who is awesome, and is getting her PhD in June, and is looking for something to do. So, but she's about industry because she's so technically good, so I don't know what she'll do, but she knows that I travel the world, and she said, wherever you go, you should mention me. There you go. By the way, when we're done here, I guess I'm going to go to the radio station, right?
Oh.
I get the student radio, whatever. Yeah, that'll be fine, and then I must leave, so we won't be able to touch base. But I'm at Barnett at Stanford. .edu, the way we do in the United States, and so, and I would love to, and I come back, and then we like to have you with us, and so the fact that I'm leaving, I don't want to come between us. If you want, and especially comments on the paper would be useful that you might not make here, maybe want to make later. Okay, so here's the question we asked going into this. There's a big question that we wonder about in the world and society around how we make sense of humanity's effect on the world. How we make sense of things determines the actions we take. And you'll see in my perspective, for those of you who are curious about my perspective, where are the roots of this perspective? There's a movement going on now in sociology, especially in computational social scientific approaches to sociology, that have been much affected by Paul DiMaggio's paper in the late 90s, which I could give you the specific reference to, and how that was followed up by a seminal paper by Amir Goldberg, one of my Israeli colleagues, in fact, an old friend of Tamar's, who, if I was a young student, I would go to Amir to be my an old guy, so I just cite him. But he's had a lot of effect on me, and so. But here's the problem we face when we're looking at how we make sense of things. The empirical manifestation of how we make sense of things is typically going to be discourse. Right? Because if you think about it, there is a cognitive process going on where we're making sense of things, which is difficult to measure. It can be, the traces of it can be measured. If we have any cognitive psychologists here, they certainly do a good job of that, cognitive scientists. But we look at discourse. And discourse has a peculiar feature in terms of the sociology and the sociological dynamics around discourse. The one that you see the most is the most superficial. Right? So the manifestation of discourse, the manifestation of sense-making that appears in public discourse that we see the most is the back and forth of hype, especially in a world where we have social media. I think in 2022, the deans came to me at the business school and they said, "Oh, this is going to be the year of sustainability," and I thought, "Oh shit." Right, because if it comes easy, it goes easy, right? And sure enough, somebody at one of the climate deniers at Stanford came to me a few weeks ago and said, "Oh, I think this sustainability thing is going away. It's a fad." And I said to him, "I hope that when I die, my grave says that this guy got confused near the end of life by a fad." Wouldn't it be great? I would love it if this was just a fad. That would be great news. Right? But obviously we know it isn't. The great acceleration of the 1950s has led to all sorts of changes in the world brought on by our own activity. And so how do we make sense of this? Well, one way we make sense of it is by seeing it as a fad, or maybe seeing it as something where there's an easy solution. But the trouble with this kind of hype is that the hype follows a hype cycle. I remember in 1998, I was teaching entrepreneurship at the Stanford Business School. I had a lecture that my students hated. It was entitled, when any idiot can start a business. Because at that point, any idiot could start a business, especially if you were a Stanford MBA idiot, because people would throw money at you for whatever. I think now it would be scooter-based food delivery. That would have to be, or whatever, right? Okay. By 2002, nobody wanted to touch the internet. The internet had been entirely a fad, if you can believe it. People were saying in 2000, you do realize when they created Google, nobody wanted to fund the company. I mean, here, scooter-based food delivery, and then you're not going to fund what became the most profitable venture in human history, right? And so this is what happens with the hype cycle. Gartner and others have turned this into an industry. But the hype cycle is a very simple sociological phenomenon where contagious processes escalate and then contagious processes de-escalate. And it is accelerated by media and social media. And the trouble with studying that approach to sense, that aspect of that empirical manifestation of sense making, is that you're simply observing the froth splashing around on the surface of the sea of life. And you're not observing the deeper currents that are actually moving humanity underneath. That's what we want to actually look at. So that was so the theoretical question is simple enough. How is humanity making sense of the Anthropocene? But the empirical strategy is more difficult. And it was Amir Goldberg's work that opened my eyes to an empirical strategy. And so let me tell you what that empirical strategy is here. It requires that we discuss a simple enough sociological concept that was introduced by Amir in 2012, the idea of a construal. And I'm sorry to use the jargon, but that way you can Google it up later, right? Because right now it's us. But so a construal. So what's a construal? What we're engaged in here when we talk about making sense is something that psychologists, sociologists talk about as meaning making. The meaning of a phenomenon does not inhere in the phenomenon. Because the same phenomenon can mean different things to different people depending on the cognitive script, often talked about using the term schema, or group of scripts, schemata, in the cognitive structure of the receiving human, which of course grows out of their past experiences and language development and everything about that makes them uniquely them. So that two of us could see the same phenomenon, and the schema that we're carrying, the schemata that we carry around, will connect the dots differently. And this is a very powerful cognitive phenomenon that affects human behavior, recall, memory. You know, if you're looking for your keys, everything will be about the keys. You could pass a pile of gold coins and it wouldn't register as important. And later, when you're recalling, you won't even know the pile of gold coins was there because you were looking for your phone or whatever it is you lost that day. I lost my phone today. Prices. But I had the minister have all found the phone. And we could see nothing but phones for about an hour, right? That was what we invoked in terms of the, right? So it turns out that, so sense making comes down to but these schema don't simply exist in isolation. And in fact, if we take a purely psychological approach, we become reductionists, which is what happens if you're only psychologists, right? I'm not trying to offend anyone, but that's a purely individual level. This is actually a shared process, that the development of your schemata and your schemata and your schemata are connected because discourse is engaging a collective process. So the construction of the schemata that we carry is a social construction. So you can think of it as a social cognitive phenomenon, not simply a cognitive phenomenon. And the way you would measure the social cognitive phenomenon would be to look at discourse, and in particular, to look at the traces in our discourse of the underlying structure that we're using to make sense out of the world. And that underlying structure is a construal. It's how we choose to construe what's coming in towards us. So let me give you an example. It's easier to speak about this by example, having laid out all this technical jargon. Let's say we're talking politics. Now you might want to make sense of any particular individual you talk to. If you say politics to them, they might think in terms of, say, the Hamas issue. You might instead talk to somebody else, they might think of abortion, right? Without respect to whether one would be better or worse, different people would construe the meaning of if you say politics to them on a different dimension. And of course, what's interesting is if you ask two people whether they agree or disagree politically, they're typically going to be focused on whether they agree or disagree politically about the position they take on a particular dimension of construal. Like, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? But in fact, the deeper question is whether or not they agree that that's the right dimension on which to construe politics. And what we often see in political discussion, and all other discussion for that matter, is that people are talking past each other because they're construing the phenomena about which they're talking on completely orthogonal dimensions that are unconnected, disconnected to one another, independent from one another.
So
it's good to see you again. Remind me your name.
Asher.
Asher, yes.
I'm just as I'm thinking about them, make sure I'm thinking about this right. So when they're talking about abortion, the missing the mark of the argument is someone saying, "Oh, you're murdering babies," or the other person saying, "You're denying women the right to choose." That is the manifestation of these different ones.
So no, in fact, let's look at this.
Okay.
Let's run with this, Asher. It's Asher.
Asher.
Asher. Okay, yeah, Asher. So in fact, it's a little bit, but it's not quite where I'm going. So let's go with. In fact, I think I'll leave Hamas out of it. But let's stick as the example. So instead, let's talk about, if I say politics to some people, they'll think it's about tax policy. A little bit about, and I'll come to you in just a second. So if it's tax policy, am I free market type, or do I want to see a higher level of taxes and a lot of social services? And so, in the example you just gave, Asher, the two people having the discussion agree that the important dimension is abortion. Where they're disagreeing is on the position they take on abortion, but they both agree that that's the important dimension. Meanwhile, somebody comes in the room who thinks that politics is about money and economics and taxes. They don't even see this as a political discussion. They say, I don't know, they're talking about abortion. I want to talk about politics. Right? Because to them, politics isn't even about abortion. Politics is about whether or not you're going to tax the rich and so forth, right? And so if you want to think of it, is we often, the froth on the surface of the sea of life is often about the positions we take. And what we often fail to see is shifts in the dimensions on which we are construing life and taking positions. So what Chauvin and I are trying to do is get at the underlying construals that people are using to make sense of the Anthropocene. What are those construals? You see where I'm going with that? So it's not so much, I think we should be sequestering carbon in the ocean. I think we should be compensating the people of the Philippines because they've been hit by super typhoons. The question about these are the surface manifestations that come and go and look like the hype cycle. But the deeper construals, how are we making sense of this? That's the question we're going to ask. You had a question.
I wanted to say, I don't know what you're looking at, but currently in Israel, there's a lot of issues between people and inside families and inside neighborhoods that a lot are considering as politics, and it's like a veil to say this is politics, so don't speak about it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is where I constantly in disagreement, because
Yeah.
when I have something to say about what the current government is doing, I don't think it's politics. I
Right.
think
Right.
these are people that are doing wrong decisions that affect us. It's not
Yes,
politics.
yes, yes.
It's not about right or left.
Right. No, I hear you. In fact, the right or left dimension often misses. This is what the Goldberg 2012 paper does, is it takes the right-left dimension, which in most places, and including the United States, where the general social survey data come from that he was analyzing, the data are a big mess. But he then identified underlying dimensions of construal that where suddenly the data become very clear, and you have different particular, and it's not a right left, it's people making sense out of political phenomena in one dimension versus another dimension versus another dimension. And you talk about family, what's your name under there? God. So you talk about the family thing. You know, one of the most fun things to do if you want to become an ethnographic sociologist, just show up at a family that you're not part of during a holiday. Right? Because what appear to be very innocent comments are actually swords and arrows being shot and bullets being shot across the room. You're like, what's going on here? Well, these are competing narratives. People aren't competing so much over the position as the underlying dimension that matters. And but let's not get into that, right? Because I'm not sure I can speak with any authority on it. I've just been, life is pain and joy, and I understand, right? So that's where a lot of it comes from. Yes, please.
So I've never known you construe, but when I think about people with different opinions on the same subject, I kind of think it's based on their values. So if I have a value that's more like, I mean, you can go into politics about it, of left with right wing, like democratic versus, values of
Yes.
nationalism versus climate, where you have, I always give an example, like, where obviously, single use is something that
Sure.
obviously is, the worst for the climate, but if you look at the very, very Haredi communities, you'll recognize for them it's like a status quo, like for them it's like it's something, and they don't understand, like, I mean, and I don't understand them and they don't understand me,
Yes.
to that extent that this conversation feels like it's almost disconnected. And I always defined it as like the values that build you
Yes.
are how you approach a topic completely
Yes.
different than the person in front of me. Is that
Well,
the
so
thing
in fact-
underlining that you're
Well,
talking
yeah,
about?
and in fact, you're going right to the morality issue that you brought up in your introduction. Do you want to come in?
What you're saying is,
Because we happen to have a moral philosopher here, so it's Andy.
but within world philosophy, there's distinction. That's the distinction made between the normative issues
Yes.
and the category where we're talking about. And I think talking about the values and the value disagreement, that's a normative issue.
Yes.
You move this beyond that. I would suggest two terms we're all familiar with: paradigms from Kuhn,
Yes.
alternative paradigms.
Sure.
They don't discuss, and I think
Yeah.
construal sounds like that instead of the value issue.
Yes.
Or whoever is still familiar with Heidegger, where in this video people read less of Heidegger, the notion of Gestalt, the
Yes.
framing of Heidegger
Yes.
is also. So
Yes.
what I'm hearing is not a
Yes.
value issue, but a matter of putting in the right context.
That's right. In fact, I'm going to run with what you just said. If the underlying, and so construals, and the Paul DiMaggio paper in 1998, discusses this at length. In fact, makes exactly the connections you make. Logics, many of DiMaggio's students went forward with the idea of institutional logics instead of construals, right? And so at some level it doesn't matter. It's a meaningful association that connects phenomena often in causal ways, but not necessarily in causal ways, right? And those meaningful associations can also be called a gestalt. I mean, it's right. So they come up in different literatures in different ways. Now, having agreed that we're going to be, if we're taking, if we're invoking a construal, if we're using a construal, so I'll stay with that just because that's where, if we're construing reality through a moral lens, it means that we're making sense of reality in terms of right versus wrong. Now, the position we take on that might depend, right? And that's different than the construal itself. And I'll tell you what got me onto thinking about this. So now I'm gonna get very concrete. That and so a little bit of this is we'll tell the autobiography of how an old business school professor ends up talking about this. Because I came to Stanford in 1991 to study success and failure of companies. And at that time, what I knew how to do was run statistical models, fancy stuff. And so for 6 years, I sat in a room doing that, as one does. And as time went on, I began interacting with companies. I always cared about sustainability. I have a whole, I'm a Catholic, I have a whole speech that I'm going to give St. Peter about why I didn't get into sustainability sooner. But you want to, but your academic career, you find yourself publishing, pretty soon you're editing journals, pretty soon you've got students, pretty soon you're running the Stanford executive program. It's just this, right? And every time you try to do something in sustainability, I'd write a paper, I'd teach a class, I'd do a research project. It wasn't very good. And I helped create this Woods Institute for Sustainability at Stanford, but it was never. And so finally, in 2019, I get a note from Mark Tessier-Levine, the guy who was the president of Stanford, and he says, "Bill, could you advise?" Because by then I'm, advising big companies about how they strategize, making money. He says, "Could you advise us because we're going to create a school of sustainability." And these scientists, some of you are scientists, super smart people. They don't know anything about organizing. It's incredible. I'll tell them stuff that you teach a first-year MBA student, and they write it down. So you got people in the National Academy of Sciences, people with the Nobel Prize are like, "Could you repeat that?" It's amazing. So I went over to help these people create a school of sustainability. I was 60 years old, and I thought, "What are you never going to do this? What am I going to do? Write another paper on strategy?" So I do this. And here's what was interesting. We collected a bunch of people at Stanford, created a school of sustainability, and there were obviously 3 different construals in this group of faculty. And so I didn't arrive at this from any high-minded theoretical starting point. This was empirically derived from an experience I had. And when I look around the world now, I see these all the time. I've been teaching sustainability to the freshmen at Stanford for the last 5 years with the great climate scientist Chris Field. And so, and we are in the middle of a book on this. The title of it is Environmental Sustainability Through 3 Lenses. And it's these 3 construals. And we teach the 18-year-olds how to understand sustainability moving from lens to lens. Now, the reason we do this is it turns out that the ability to identify that you're engaging in a construal leads to a level of wisdom, a type of wisdom, described by the political psychologist Phil Tetlock as cognitive complexity. So Phil was my teacher back in the day, and Phil went back and identified in the political records the degree of cognitive complexity, the ability to move between construals among political leaders. John Kennedy, for example, after the Bay of Pigs, had a big increase in the cognitive complexity of dialogue going on in the Oval Office. They have records of this. Because after they made this mistake in the Bay of Pigs, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it, it's just a big mistake. After that, Kennedy brought in, from Harvard, of course, because, East Coast, the good news, though, is he's Irish Catholic. But he brought in these Harvard guys, and their job was to disagree with him. So they would sit around the Oval. We don't do that now in the Oval Office. Right? So Khrushchev, meanwhile, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was very low on cognitive complexity. Now there was a point where if you interpreted Khrushchev's actions as rationally, as through a rational actor construal, you would have shut the missiles off. But the smart people in the room challenged Kennedy on that and said, no, wait a minute. What if we construe what we're seeing as the outcome of bureaucratic politics in the Soviet military? Then you wouldn't. You would instead pull your missiles out of Turkey and they would de-escalate, and that's what happened. And it was that cognitive complexity that led to the not shooting of the missiles, right? The fact that we didn't have a nuclear exchange, which obviously would have escalated, and that would not have been good. And I notice with cognitive complexity, it's not about that you agree or disagree on a position. It's that you're understanding how the other is making sense of the phenomenon. Right? That's cognitive complexity. So if we can identify how humanity is construing climate change, we can also see whether or not we're doing a better job of being cognitively complex. Okay, so that's what we're up against. Now, can I give a couple more examples?
Yeah.
Okay, because examples help here. And so let's start. So I told you there. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yes, no.
Apologies, just for the examples.
Yes.
I want to ask about the last sentence you said, and taking into account the kind of like a populist era that we live in.
Yes.
And sometimes, and I speak from a personal perspective, I doubt that there is a rational
What
process.
says no sense?
Yeah. I mean, the politics of identities. I identify myself as a left-wing person, so I have to agree that there are climate change.
Yes.
I have to, because this is part of my group of people that I identify
Sure.
within. So a question about, I mean, it's still about this position, or yeah.
So the way to think of this, so Noam brings up, just to repeat what you've said, and if I get it right, Noam brings up, in the current discussions around climate, we have populism, which doesn't seem to make sense from the perspective of someone who, like Noam, is on the left.
Or maybe from the right, I don't know.
Okay, or maybe, but right? And in fact, that's exactly the importance of identifying construals, because there are logics behind those who call themselves populists, or who we choose to call populists.
Right.
But those logics are based on dimensions of construal different than the ones that we're invoking. And so we speak past each other. Right? We speak past each other. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you think that there should be, or if there is, a baseline, maybe a scientific knowledge, I don't understand.
Yes.
Which all the lenses must start from
Yes.
in order to create
Yeah.
a understanding of, even if there are a lot of
Sure.
lenses, but
Sure.
is there anything that must be, that we must agree on?
So Raphael,
Whenever- I'm from the Ministry of Education, yes,
Yes.
and this is what we are trying to deal with when we are teaching students from different places all over Israel, from different
Yes.
societies. And is there anything that we must start with and then
Yes.
try to understand the lenses that the students look at this
Yes.
phenomena?
So there are many things that are true. It doesn't mean there are multiple truths.
Mm-hmm.
It means there are many things that are true. But which things we notice that are true depend on the lens we use, and bear with me, because as I go through this, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And a great thing for you to make sure your students learn, because especially that's why I asked their age, we spoke earlier, And the age of a person determines the degree to which they can maintain multiple construals. There comes a point where you can do that. And typically there's a point where that's not possible. Right? We're basically going all the way back to the point of the theory of mind. And so once we're aware of awareness, then we can maintain multiple construals. And by the time these teenagers are happening, as confused as they seem, they are aware of awareness. Right? And so what you'll see is there are many truths, and the lens we look through will determine which of those we care about with respect to climate change. So should I go into these?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me do that. There's no rush to, because
You can stay with your list of
yeah, I don't actually like to look at that, because that's like the jobs I'm not getting done. See, what happened is, I'll quickly explain the problem. So I said yes, and I called my dean, who at the time was John Levin, who's now the president of Stanford, but he would take Cecil's place. But I said, well, there's this thing they're doing, and that worked out. So now I'm the chair of a department I created there. We have a new PhD program that you should apply to. Okay, yeah. And I mean, I can't get you in, but I am the chair, so. But I didn't lose my old job. I wanted to keep that because I've been there my whole life, and it's actually good to have two deans, because when one says no, you go to the other one and say yes, right? That doubles your chances. And then the other stuff. So anyway, yeah. So that's so I said when I got together with the scientists and engineers who were creating the School of Sustainability, I saw three lenses. Let's talk about the first one. That's the technical lens. Think Bill Gates, right? Writes a book about, we got a problem, let's solve it. This is what climate change is about, right? It's about gigatons and gigawatts. It's not wrong. It just illuminates an aspect of the truth, right? Some things that are true are illuminated this way. And I'm not critical of the technical lens. I mean, if I'm stuck in an elevator, I want to be with Bill Gates, right? Later, when I get out, I'll bring in the moral philosophers, and we'll be pissed off about how I got stuck in an elevator. But during the time I'm in the elevator, I want an engineer, right? And that's kind of that's the technical lens. And there's a lot of that going on. The current dean of the Stanford Door School of Sustainability, Arun Majumdar, comes from this lens. Right? He's at the Department of Energy. He's an expert in pyrolysis, which we'll talk about a company here that does pyrolysis. Some of you know about. Some of you may be experts in, which I will completely ruin by saying that it's sort of burning at zero oxygen, and it sequesters carbon in pellets, and that's how sociology understands pyrolysis. Okay, so here we have, we're up in Aalborg. So what makes, some countries have about as many people in them as a middle-sized Chinese city. Anyway, and Denmark's also one of those. And what makes them amazing is not so much that you would scale anything there that would touch the data on climate or whatever, right? Because you look at China or something like that. But because they can be centers of innovation that scale globally, which is why you people are so interesting. I mean, you're interesting for a million reasons, but that's one of the many reasons, right? And as are the Danish. And so what makes this place so interesting, so Green Lab is a collective effort, and like Israel, the Danish have no problem occasionally doing things collectively. And so they have this area set aside with lots of wind power so that scientists and engineers can go in and build things to scale in a way that would be powered by wind power and so forth, and then take them out into the world. And we'll talk about one of those ventures. This was the brainchild of Henrik Stiesdal, the inventor of the wind turbine, who I met through Alon talk. That's the way of the world, right? You just meet people, and you meet people, and you meet people, and pretty soon you end up in Aalborg, where the people are individually large but collectively small. right? And it's a tremendous kind of experiment. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But that's the technical lens in action, right? Let's find solutions to renewable power. But the technical lens can also concern itself with things like water. And this was my first visit here. This is not a slide that I went and dredged up for this visit. I've been using this slide since I came to talk about the visit here, which had a big impact on me. In fact, after this, I want to go down and get another picture standing in front of that amazing valley below the grave of the founder, right? And it's just because I had a picture, I don't know, what do you think? The beard, not the beard? Do I worry about this? Does anybody care with me? Anyway, and I got to see a lot yesterday, in fact. It was a great thing. And I learned a lot about drip irrigation, started a case study of Netafim, which has obviously gone through some recent big changes too, but it's been a world changer. There's drip irrigation because of these innovations here, all over the Salinas Valley in California. In the Philippines, they have this. Why would you have drip irrigation in the Philippines? Well, because there's plenty of water, but what about the methane release from the rice paddies, right? And so, there's all sorts of interesting scaling that came out of this. And that is a technical perspective, right? That is the technical lens in action. It's not only wires and energy, but it's really any understanding of the instrumental relations of causality is a technical lens, right? The instrumental relations of causality, other than the ones that include human behavior. You could group them all together and just say it's an instrumental lens, and I thought about doing that. But human behavior, you could also think of it in instrumental terms, but it typically follows logics that are quite distinct from the technical logics of physics or engineering or biology. And so, in fact, I've distinguished between two different instrumental lenses. The technical lens we see among the engineers and physical scientists and natural scientists, many of you here, and the behavioral lens, which is also an instrumental lens, but it's understanding things in terms of human behavior. Human behavior at any of three levels of analysis. Individual level behavior, the psychologists in your organization behavior group, right? The psychologists who look at the effects of human behavior, whether it's sustainable, whether it's not sustainable. The organization level of analysis, which is where all the organizational research comes in, to which you referred. And that's where most of my research is. This paper actually won't have as much organizational, but I am doing work on that. And then also the higher level of systems, regulation, capitalism versus other means or other systems for organizing systems of production and society. So all the economists, and where's our environmental economist here? And so the work you do, I don't know your work in particular, but now that we've made acquaintance, all the applications of environmental economics to regulatory systems is a behavioral lens at the highest level. How can we solve the tragedy of the commons with intelligent design of regulatory systems? Nobel Prizes and the likes of Nordhaus and Ellen Oster and so forth over the years on solving the collective action problem is the behavioral lens. In this case, the behavioral lens in action, it's a biologist who's not really doing biology at this point. She does biology. Professor Fernandez is talking with me here about a visit I had just paid to the fisher folk just north of here. And the small-scale fisheries are super interesting. My colleague, someone in my department, one of my professors, Javier Basurto, has the lead article in Nature in the last issue. You would have seen it, where he studied small-scale fisheries all over the world. They are individually quite small, by definition, and collectively they account for 60% of the seafood-based proteins eaten by humanity. They're very important collectively. Adaptation of our food system is a behavioral problem for them, for all of us, but involving them. Because technically they know how to fish. This isn't the issue. The question is, where do they fish? And the behavioral issue with small-scale fisheries is the question of, and this is what I learned, we knew it, but I learned it firsthand talking to the, up in Las Cruces, meeting with the fisher folk. They fish where their fathers fished, and their sons will fish there too. The trouble is, the fish aren't there, because the water got warm. So the fish have moved south, and they would have to move their family. So they're trying to figure out now how to farm fish, or follow the fish. This is a behavioral challenge that Professor Fernandez is trying to solve using technologies for information dissemination. Basically, apps that the fisher folk use that tell them where they can go to fish. It's purely a behavioral adjustment. It's not a change in the technology involved. We see the behavioral lens in the agroforestry revolution that's going on here. We're in Manaus. I didn't, by the way, mean this to be a journey through my hat collection, but it is. I do. Once you lose your hair, the hats become kind of a thing. So somebody pointed out that that's kind of what the salient thing is they remember about this presentation. This was a super interesting visit, right? Because you've got first of all, name the scientists. They're the women. So they're the experts on mushrooms. And this is up near Manaus, in Amazonia, right off of the Rio Negro. And what has been going on that is difficult and troubling in Amazonia is that the indigenous people, in this case the Tucano tribe, and here you have Ipusoni, he's representing he's one of the leaders in the Chicano tribe, have been burning forests to be able to grow crops to make money, or sometimes harvesting the hardwood to sell to make money. And what these scientists have done is discovered rare and exotic mushrooms that grow all over this part of the Amazon, which people in Korea and Japan pay a lot of money to eat. But the beauty of this cash crop is it doesn't require that you deforest. So agroforestry is basically an organizational innovation that allows for a behavioral change so that self-interested behavior at the level of the tribes is in harmony with what we would need with respect to a sustainability outcome of preserving the world's rainforests. Now this is very important, right? Americans have a very bad reputation for going around the world and telling people, we've industrialized, thank you very much, now you leave your rainforests intact because we would prefer them to continue to exist. That would be good for us. Now, and you have to confront yourself with the fact that in Amazonia there are 700 urban areas. There are lots of people who need to live. And if we don't think of interventions and mechanisms and institutions that allow for human behavior to be both rational, self-interested, and good for them economically at the same time that it's good for nature, we don't look for the ability to compete through sustainability, then we end up having those be at odds with one another. And this is an innovation in that and you would only identify this looking through the behavioral lens. It's different than the technical lens. They're both true things, right? Both of the lenses are getting at truth, but they're getting at truth that's only seen when you look through a particular lens. Now, both the behavioral lens and the technical lens are instrumental in the sense they think of cause-effect relations in the world around. They don't get at this issue of the value judgment about the right or wrong of the things we see. That would be the moral lens. Think environmental justice. Now you can see why I started thinking these three lenses as we brought together the scholars who would become the sustainability school at Stanford. Because I've got my engineers and they're over here with batteries and hydrogen and so forth. Or Alon Bengal talking about drip irrigation, right? And then you have the behavioral folks, basically in my department, looking at human behavior, organizational behavior, regulatory behavior. But then we've got the moral folks. Maxine Burkett came from the administration. The same thing that happened with you, Tamar. I went and met Maxine when she was in the Biden administration. She wrote the world's plastics treaty. Super important. She's an expert in environmental justice from a legal perspective. And she's much loved by our philosophers, which is the true test of the legal scholar's office. If they get it from the philosophical perspective at the same time that they're looking at it from a legal perspective, that means that the construal clears two different bars, right? And so Maxine, we got Maxine to come to Stanford, where she now, so we created a Center on Environmental Justice, which she runs, and she's a force of nature. So it's and that way we attract people who look through the moral lens. Now, they might disagree on the positions they take within that lens. Getting back to the earlier conversation, I can't remember now who brought this up. Thank you. Yes, right? They might disagree on the particular positions they take, but what they're agreeing on is that this is an issue of right versus wrong. This is not just an issue of gigatons or solving the Manker-Olson collective action problem. Sorry to you're like Mr. Collective Action Problem, but that's who you are for me right now. Right, I've used here the example of the Mapuche people. Did you meet them? Did you meet them? So it was the year before you. So every year we bring change makers into Stanford from 5 different organizational forums, 16 different parts of the world, to come together to look at change going from the bottom up. Which is the talk I gave yesterday. Is more of a public talk. It's a little more fun than this talk, but as public talks have to be. But these are the Mapuche. These are the Mapuche. Some of the leaders of the Mapuche people. It's a tribe that is led by its women.
Maybe they were actually.
Yeah, were they there?
Yeah.
The Mapuche. So these are the Jaramillo sisters. And in fact, in Chile, that flag, in some parts of Chile, is seen as a terrorist symbol. And the Mapuche were, they suffered genocide in Argentina, but they still they suffered it in Chile too, but there's still several million of them in Chile, living largely in harmony with the environment, using methods that are traditional. So traditional environmental knowledge that is not appreciated as much by the large factories that have been built up in the mining sector, in the forestry sector. And so we work with them now to try to make their point through Chilean law to preserve the sustainable practices of their indigenous community and maintain their rights. It's a right versus wrong thing. If you want an even more vivid illustration of it, this was when I asked Asmania, I said, Asmania, after she told me her story, I said, Asmania, I always promise to come back as I go back. American academics have a reputation for kind of one and done, right? So you have to keep going back. Keep going back. That even surprised you, But anyway, so Asmania, I said, Asmania, I want to tell your story. How do I introduce you? She said, I am Asmania, leader of the Defenders of Pari Island. So this is right off, it's in Indonesia. We are standing on a mountain of dead coral that was dredged by a corrupt government from that little area in a failed attempt to build a marina for tourism or whatever it was. And once the bribes had all been paid, they didn't care anymore. And meanwhile, the biodiversity, which hinges on the existence of that coral, was destroyed. And she was explaining to me here that her husband and all the other fishermen have to go a long way away now. Find the fish, and there was a lot more to it than that, but it's a right versus wrong, right? This is the moral lens.
Is it always right versus wrong, or are there two kind of different rights?
Well, that was, in fact, is that a smart question? So this is the moral philosophical question. Are there different rights and wrongs? Right? And of course, what we do when we identify the moral lens is not which of the dimensions, if there are multiple rights and wrongs, it's whether you're thinking in terms of right and wrong at all. So we beg the question in this study. And so if I identify, and by the way, my dean has become much more cognitively complex over time, because he's come to realize, having to be the dean of the entire school, that not everybody is an engineer. And that in fact some of these people are basically moral philosophers, or they're practicing without a license, but nonetheless they're thinking in terms of right and wrong. Or they're behavioral. And we sit in the Appointments and Promotions Committee, and I sit there with, scientists who study soil, and people who study magma in other planets. I never thought I would use the word magma in any conversation, never mind in deciding on someone's tenure. But, we have to look across the lenses, right? And so all we're looking at is whether or not, that's what we want to see, is whether the currents in humanity's way of making sense of things include the moral lens, and to what extent do they? So to turn this into a research project, we chose a corpus of discourse. We had to choose a corpus of discourse, and the one we chose, I learned about from my friend Chris Field, the climate scientist. He was one of the original, he was the primary author of the original IPCC reports. Okay, so Chris is he's kind of the Moses of climate scientists. I'm sure he would bristle at this. I told him, I can make you Moses or I can make you Jesus. And so he just did this. Because I always say that teaching climate science with Chris Field is, I'm Catholic, I'm an Irish Catholic. Teaching climate science with Chris Field is like saying Mass with Jesus, right? Because if a question comes up, I just, I have a book, but I got him, so he answers the question. And what Chris pointed out is that when the IPCC makes a report, right, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report is obviously written by scientists, but the public at large can comment on that report. And the authors of the report must do something about the comments. They don't necessarily have to change what they've written, but there has to be some kind of response. Even non-response is a response, so they have to at least have, right? And so those commentaries are available. So what Shoban and I did is we took the report that was issued in 2013, and we took the report that was issued in 2024, and we trained large language models to go in and identify whether comments were construing climate change as a technical issue, as a behavioral issue, and or as a moral issue. So it's not a forced or, but I will tell you, if you want to do this, you have to independently run this through your large language model. Because if you do them as a multinomial choice, the large language model informs one decision by the other, and they become non-independent. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But I would have sent you the paper, by the way, but we're right in the middle of writing it. And it was a race, and I didn't get it done in time. Please.
What do you think about spiritual lens?
Say it again.
Spiritual lens.
Oh, the spiritual lens. Interesting. It's funny because I'm a practicing Catholic. I have thought a lot about this question, which doesn't necessarily touch on spirituality, I realize. Okay. Without getting too, like, if this becomes therapeutic, it's going to be good for me and not good for anybody else. Okay, so, but if you take Laudato Si, the encyclical on the environment written by the late Pope Francis, that many people, you might not, but many people would say, well, what we're invoking here is a spiritual lens, in the sense we're making sense of the environment through a set of beliefs about God, about the meaning of being human, about right and wrong. And in that sense, I would include the spiritual lens as a particular moral lens. And in fact, you can have multiple spiritual lenses. Right? And I realize I'm on rocky ground here when I say that spiritual lenses are a particular moral lens, because there's a massive history in philosophy around just this subject. In fact, you couldn't write philosophy without throwing in an acknowledgement of God lest you be killed, right? Which was always handy because you could solve, the cogito or anything else, because could God be a deceiver, right, and such. But I think it's fair to say that it's much more a moral lens than it is a technical or a behavioral lens.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, of
So
course.
I know it's not the focus of this
No, it's
study
okay.
and the
I don't know if you've noticed, but I like
I'm
about any
interested
questions.
about
Yeah.
this comparative perspective regarding feedback on the IPCC and reports and so on.
Yes.
So were you also looking at generation gap and age and gender and global south and global west? Have you seen this?
Yes, we're going to get to that. We'll get to the global south and north. We wanted to get at gender, but we can identify the commentators. The people making the comments don't have to be scientists.
They get their names?
Pardon me? We know their names, but then there's the issue of gendering names, which is complicated. And so we ended up going with global south and north because I could get that done by the time so we're going to go there with respect to. Or you look exactly like David Krebs, the economist. Yes, you do. You look exactly like David Krebs. You just say that. But David Krebs is not poor. Anyway, I don't want to get in trouble with him. But yes, go ahead.
So I will start with a story. 1,000 years from now, alien came to Los Angeles and started to excavate where Professor Barnett lived. They see on the billboard the Kardashian family, and they say, okay, Professor Barnett worship this female goddess, and all people in LA did that. Then they see a lot of plastic waste around you, and they say this is like the main theme of the people who live in LA. They will come to Israel, and they will go to Tel Aviv, they will see Bibi's picture, and say, people here, it's like a worship this god male called Bibi, and they have a lot of plastic. I'm showing this because you have so many lenses, and I want like a method to get from you to uncloak like the confounding factors to get into the real construals that society sees so that I can build on it.
Yes,
so
yes.
you said there are still different dimensions sometimes, or different lenses. So
Yes.
how can I come to the crux of like
Yes.
what is like important for me to have a bigger impact factor and work in society that's so diverse and so different?
Right. This is such a super smart. Can you flip your name card over so I can remember your name? Because okay, thank you, Fardy. That was a super smart question. There's an arbitrariness to this, isn't there? Why those lenses? Why not any other lenses? Is there some grand theory of lenses that would lead you to that? And the answer is no. That often what happens in social science, and so we're going to take a little bit of a side journey into the philosophy of science and the hypothetico-deductive process. The thing about social science is that the very phenomena we study is who we are. And you stop and think about that, right? It makes it very different than those of you who say study the soil or whatever other things you study. There's a separateness of the humans from the, right, but in the social sciences, we study essentially ourselves, which means our understanding of humanity informs even the questions we ask. And that's been formalized in the hypothetico-deductive process in the spirit of the Kuhnian paradigmatic view, the development of science. We attend to certain things, and we don't attend to some other things because of what we've experienced. I happen to give the experience that I had in helping to create a school to come up with those three lenses. But more completely, the way to think of this, or more systematically, I think, the way to think of this process in the social sciences is to remember that there's both an, and this is true in all science, but there's both an inductive and deductive side of learning. Down here are the phenomena. Up here is our theories that make sense of the phenomena. Our experience in the phenomena will inform us, and that's induction, or abduction, but we'll just say induction, it's good enough. And then that theoretical perspective that we gain from having experienced phenomena, we will then use to make sense of phenomena through deduction. And if it all seems really complicated, think of it just in terms of why I so enjoy my granddaughter, Nina. Now, I have many children and many grandchildren, but Nina gets all my attention because she's 4. Which means she's the most ignorant person I ever talk to, and that makes her the most interesting person. Because she's constantly going around being amazed at things I don't even notice. Right? That's the inductive part. And then she sees, like, she had a bottle of water, she'd pour it into that computer just to see what happens. I won't do that because I know better. Right? And then she'll come away with a theory of electricity and whatever, right? Which, and the grandparents' role, by the way, is to prevent death during the process of learning by the granddaughter, right? So what happens is the inductive part is hugely important here, because what we get exposed to as scientists, as social scientists, decides the choice we'll make about the dimensions. When Amir Goldberg wrote this paper in 2012, he had so much experience seeing political discourse in the United States that he could talk about the different dimensions, and sure enough, they emerged from the data. There was nothing absolute about them, nothing taxonomically given as something that would apply on another planet or, you know, at some other time. Which is why your reference is so great, because it's getting at this question of whether there's an absolute or universal taxonomy of construals. There might be, I don't know, but what we've done is we've simply allowed these construals to emerge from the data. I was dissatisfied to have the inductive process shaped entirely by a Stanford professor hanging out with a bunch of other Stanford professors creating a school, which is why we went to 16 parts of the world and stratified a sample of 5 different organizational forms, and then intentionally went to change makers like Tamar Zandberg and others, along Bengal and others, right, to see what we were getting with respect to possible construals. And we still came away with behavioral, technical, and moral. I don't know that I've done the right thing with it. It could be entirely arbitrary, but it seems to make sense of the data.
Is 3 your magic number?
You know? You know, this is my first study like this, so I don't know. If I do a couple of more studies, say 3, and all of them end up with 3, then I'm going to think of you.
So the Holy Trinity, you said you can't, so
Yes, yeah, there's that. Oh my gosh. Where's the hospital lady? Where is she?
No, she's not here.
She's not here.
She went to the health session.
She went to the health session.
You're competing with 6 other sessions.
Oh, so there's another session with really good-looking, physically fit people in it. That's the one, yeah. Oh, there they go again. Those are the good guys, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. Just want to make sure. All right, shall we get into what I did with this now? We're past the picture part. So I'll talk a little about the data and methods. Those of you who want to do this will probably want to follow up, because there's a lot more to it than I'll do here. So if you like to use modern computational methods, that's what we do. Because you've got this. So this explains a little more about the IPCC reports and so forth. There are different stages of the report, and there's the initial report and the comments on that, and then there's the report for policymakers, which is typically thought of as the more sophisticated report. The results I'm giving you are on the first report. It turns out they're even stronger in the one for policymakers. So these are my weakest results, and the paper has both in it, but it's not ready for. It's a paper that's like you know how when you got the tables and bullet points. So I better write it. It's half written. So so this tells the process of the generation of the IPCC report, and the number of comments, this is the corpus, right? So the 2014 report, the 2023 report. Sorry, I thought it was 20. I think I said 1324, but right? These are the 2 panels. And so you've got 152,000 comments here, 181,000 comments there. Now, those comments can be anything that, and this is the process that leads up to the publication of the report. Actually, now the comments, here I give you some examples. A lot of the training, there's a whole literature now on prompt engineering, right? Which is, if you're using large language models, by the way, we use Llama here. We're also using some other open source large language models to check the results on this. And the inner rate of reliability is improving. So these aren't final results yet. So the basic method, for those of you who don't do this, for those of you who do this, you already know all this, but you train the model to do this. You engineer essentially the prompts, and we're doing it one shot. Okay, so, but then you have to also train humans to do it, my research assistants, and then you have to see whether or not the machine is getting it right the way humans would get it right. And that inner rate of reliability is a threshold you need to get to before this is considered sufficiently accurate as in terms of the large language model. And that's probably corpus specific, meaning we're getting it trained to work well on IPCC report commentaries, right? It may not work as well if you were looking at other kinds of, and so these are examples of the kinds of comments. It's very subtle, right? It's very subtle. So take this normative comment. It has not been mentioned that communities reliant on subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering, for example, many indigenous communities, have already and will continue to experience local changes in wildlife ranges and population sizes. It is, by the way, a Dickensian sentence. And if you look at it carefully and diagram it, it is a sentence fragment. But it's what they wrote. And fish communities as species move farther north or altitudinally with increased temperatures or changes in climatic patterns. And then there's no verb. Anyway, this will have negative impacts on food security. Now, if all they said was this will have negative impacts on food security, it would be a technical comment. But because they talked about it hurts some, and implicitly, not others, I would code it as a normative or moral. Right? So it's about fairness. It may also be something we could code as technical, but it's primarily normative in a way, right? And so you can see what you get at here. Because you're analyzing what people are saying, not in terms of the right or wrong of what they're saying, whether you agree or don't agree, it's what construal are you using to make sense of the world.
Can you say something about the people that wrote those comments? Who are they? Where are they from? Where is it published that you can comment about?
Yeah, so it's all online, and you yourself could go on and comment during a period after the publication of the report, after which it's closed. And this was also Omer's question, which is a very good question. How much do we know about them? We'll be making a distinction about whether they're from the global north or the global south. You could probably do more with it, but right now that's as far as we've gone. We know their names, and then you know their country, and so that's what we ran.
In your previous slide, I thought
Yes.
you categorized them as experts. Why would you call them experts if anybody from the public can comment?
So what's happening here is that the report, since I've gone back now, the report itself is made by experts. The commentaries on the report, any of us can do. It turns out they are more sophisticated. If you actually look, sometimes they'll even identify the organization they're from. They tend to be, sociologists call it enthusiasts, right? It could include lay experts, it could include actual experts, but it could just include somebody who cares. Because there's no barrier. You don't have to qualify in to do comments on each report.
You know that in Israel, every legislation that is being offered has to go through a period of open to the public comments.
Yes.
And many people comment, and sometimes NGOs campaign for people to come and comment.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, that could be going on here too. we take as a given that the comments are happening. Because if you think of it from a sampling perspective, the broader the better at some level, because we're getting at what are the underlying construals, not whether they're right or wrong, not whether
it's hard to take into account 150,000 comments. Do you use AI to reduce it to the essence?
Yes, that's why we use AI. Okay. So when I were young scholars, I used to do this kind of thing, one line at a time, right? And then we went through a whole period in computational social science, probably, the year 2000 to, whatever, 2015, where we would write our own code to go in and try to get at the linguistic structure of things using computers so that we could get bigger data sets and more, right, because it's just so time consuming. And then large language models have so systematized that we're able to, but of course there's a layer of mystery when you use a large language model. And so that's why we have to use an open source large language model, because it could be that later people will learn that there was something about these LLMs that was leading to a bias or something. And if we were to use ChatGPT, that's not frozen in time and it's an entirely mysterious black box, so we can't use ChatGPT. I will tell you how this ended up coming about. I was talking about these three lenses to my students, and I was to my PhD students, and Shobana walked in a week later and had used ChatGPT to analyze this corpus. And I said, this is brilliant. Let's do it. You'll be first author, but we can't use ChatGPT, right? And so it actually emerged. I didn't even think of doing it because I'm old school. Now, I wasn't going to sit there and read all 300,000 of them, but I'm at Stanford. Maybe I could employ 300,000 people. And there was another hand up here. Did I see? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
You might be getting to this,
Yeah,
but
maybe.
I'm wondering if you're projecting the three categories here onto the data, or you're asking the data to give you categories that it comes up with all by itself.
So you can do that. So it is possible to ask. That's super smart. Okay. So so a neural network model can identify patterns which, once we recognize them, could be logics. I'll give you my favorite example. Mina's father, my son Ian. He's a mathematician. And in fact, he left his professorship at the University of Pennsylvania because he figured out how to make large language model neural networks predict the outcome of horse races. So he's a very wealthy man. Mina's taken care of, as is Yumi. He married a Korean woman, American woman. So there's those little Hapa babies, they're awesome. And they live in the Bay Area. And he has this basement that looks like something out of James Bond. It's got all these screens. Now, he doesn't know anything about horse racing. And in fact, when he was at the University of Pennsylvania, in the medical school, he was predicting suicide based on people's cell phone use, using neural networks. Another one of my sons, who's an actual scientist, right? He genetics and cures cancer and this kind of, comes up with. He's very critical. They get along, but he says to my mathematician son, "You've never even taken a biology class. How can you be working at the medical school?" Right? Because all he's doing is. But the point is, he lets the neural network decide on the prediction. Now you can go back and try to reverse engineer what the logic was that it found, but you can use a purely inductive approach. I chose not. Now, some people would disagree. They'd say, no, you chose to do that, Bill, but you chose to allow your neural network to interpret the data you saw in 16 parts of the world. Come up with lenses which you then instructed the large language model to identify. Sorry, although there's a couple of other hands. But let me go up and then I'll come down, because we're here to have a discussion. You were just doing your hair. Okay, well, I thought you were raising your hand. Okay, all right. Sorry. I don't mean. Okay, I always up with a hand. So yeah, do we have another up here? Okay, you got it, Fardy.
Yes, regarding the diversity. So are the comments made in English? So I'll give you an example. For example, this is a problematic because even if you translate, some things lost in translation. So give me a small example. When I was in Morocco, the Amazighi, they translated in English as free people. So when I met an Amazighi in the big mosque in Casablanca, he told me, no, it's not free. It got mistaken translated to free people. It's meaning authentic people.
Yes.
But for some reason, everybody says Amazighi, it's free people. It should be authentic.
Yes.
So when you're hearing these comments, it's an American, at the end of the day, American Stanford point of view that dictate to the world what other construes that they should be. So when you meet your Chinese counterparts, what does he tell you?
Yes, and it's not only multilingual, this issue, it's more generally, or at least the way I'm going to interpret your very good point, is that there's the formal denotation of language, but there's also all the connotation that is built into even things like tone, right? And so in the prompt engineering, that's where all the work goes. Because when we first were doing this, any time a comment had the word should, the machine stupidly thought it was normative. Right? Like, you should say more about how batteries hold electricity. They would say it's normative. Because the word should. So then we look at it and say, oh, stupid machine, okay. And then you have to go on to explain. Because if you explain it to the machine, you can even, in prompt engineering, ask the machine to critique the machine's biases and ignorance. And the machine will use the entire corpus that it's been exposed to say, well, it's often the case that a person says free people, but they really mean authentic, or whatever else the thing, right? So there's a lot of back and forth to try to get at this. Can I ever escape my own identity as the researcher? Never. And this is a big debate in the social sciences.
Do you try to reach out, for other machines in China, in Germany, in Russia, just to get perspective, about your...
So there is also the process of arriving at the truth. This is one paper. You can imagine multiple papers over time that would build, and this is how the accretion of knowledge happens. And it's one of the big issues. One of the big issues in the analysis of discourse is what you have raised. But discourse itself has a lot of, it's not so much language specific, although it certainly is, as it is culture specific in its meaning. And we all experience this, right? We experience this whenever I spend a lot of time in Ireland, where my family's from originally. And it's so easy to make a mistake there if you behave like an American. Hopefully they hear your accent and they cut you some slack, right? That's already happened to me here like 50 times, and I've been here 4 days. Right? But, there were hands. Either that or everybody's doing their hair. Yeah, go ahead.
After you make your detailed study and you find your report, do you have a method of influencing the politicians to listen to you? Because at the end of the day, some person like Donald Trump will say climate change is nonsense, and he has political reasons to have fossil fuels. Your report, how do you make sure that your report is going to get into somebody's mind?
Yeah, it's always hard to say, Murray, right? Impact is the hard part, right? But what I would caution us on here is that much of what we think is having impact is actually us just going out and splashing around in the froth on the surface of the sea of life. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to have impact, but my greatest impact comes through trying to identify things that I think are true, which might become part of human knowledge going forward. Some people are really good at affecting policymakers, and I haven't been one of those people historically. I mean, it's not too late, I guess. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a follow-up or something connected to the last comment or question. And it might be a stupid question, but I want to go back to the basics of the beginning,
Sure.
or the big picture. Basically what you're showing us, and it is really, really important that people look at that from different lenses, different categories, different point of view. And this definitely affect our probability to exchange knowledge, to talk, to get to some agreement, or at least know what we disagree about.
Right.
And after all these studies, and it's really, really important, what are your suggestions?
Yeah.
What are your tips in order to make these arguments or conversations more efficient, useful, and so on? What's that?
Yeah, what would you do with the, so we're getting a little ahead because I haven't shown you my results. But no, that's okay, don't apologize, Yaron. I mean, it's an awesome question. But I tend to move in the direction of, I spend a lot of time with leaders of companies, so I think a lot about what organizations ought to do if they were going to be more effective in competing on sustainability. And that is to build a moral lens into the argument around why the company exists and what it does. Right, so there's a part of this that I apply in the world that I normally frequent, which is the organization level. But you can imagine policy, people would look at it right from their way, and people, there's also there's a strongly moral side of the psychology literature that looks at so, for example, at Stanford, Professor Dale Miller from the business school is running a conference later this year on morality and help me people collective. It's Dale Miller's thing. It's basically collective ignorance. There's another name for it.
Amnesia?
No. It's anyway. So, but it's where we collectively arrive at the false.
Common wisdom.
Yeah, but it's the opposite, right? Anyway, so somebody Google Dale Miller collective and it'll come up, right? So everybody's Googling now. So, and so for him, it would be at the level of aggregating. Do we end up with wisdom of the crowd, or do we end up with this collective ignorance problem, right? And so, so it really depends. What you do with these depends on
collective errors.
Collective error.
Errors. Yeah. Collective errors.
Okay, so there we go.
Yeah.
So, so the application of knowledge, that's always how it goes with knowledge, right? Once you have the knowledge, then how one applies it depends on who you are and where you see applicability of that knowledge. Okay, so I'll jump into what we did here. We had the lenses. So this is a little bit, I had to do it kind of two-step, because first you have to identify the actual discourse, because not everything is substantive. And in fact, we went through and identified kind of 4 different kinds of comments for purposes of just making this distinction, right? You could just have, add a comment, or add a comma, right? This sentence is too long. That doesn't have any meaning. Or some people would say, like, great job, or meh. Okay. And then there's ambiguous, where you don't know what to do with it, and so you're actually better off saying that this is only noise because I can't find meaning. And so this is what you want. You want the substantive, and so we first pass it through that, and then you end up with substantive, and then you allow for the lens classifications, right? You run it 3 times to get the lens classifications.
Why do you have Facebook sign up there?
Okay. Because that's where the open source large language model Llama is made available by Meta. And because it's open source, it's both open source and it's fixed it has versions. So we can stamp the version, save the version, so that future scholars can question my work and can go back and try to replicate or show where there was something that was problematic.
You study not only social media, like this model, like this.
No. So I'm not studying social media. It's that Facebook has made available this tool for humanity to use.
Have you thought about that? That's very interesting. Have you thought about letting like 3 different or several different machines to study this?
Yes. So right now, Shobana is running the same results through open source, right, and or through OpenAI, and
the results.
And I don't know yet. So she's working. And everything takes a lot of time and uses a lot of carbon. So, I'm aware of, but there it is. Okay. Okay. So, okay, we get to this part. Yeah, go ahead.
I know the questions are inside the talk, but just to mention that we have something like 25 minutes till we have to wrap up totally.
No problem. So it's
universal time.
I think it's got to be.
Because you do have the questions in the
yeah,
talk,
because
so
there's
that's
another
fine.
thing
Just-
coming up, right?
just
They
to
gotta,
make
they
sure
gotta, you
that-
gotta eat too,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you don't want to get in the way of that.
Make sure-
So you're good. Oh, that's plenty of time. That's plenty of time.
Fine.
Yeah, because I mean, this is the best part.
Yeah.
So, but thank you.
We were gonna have Q&A, but it's a lecture.
Yeah, I never really need Q&A because
Sure.
this is how everything happens. Yeah. So I go into a little bit of detail here. We don't really need to go into this, but this is the actual structuring of prompts if people want to see, because those of you who've done this know, but this is actually how you go in and give it prompts. You're having a conversation with it, and which ends up in the output. That's actually how you do this. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask something?
Please
Sorry.
do.
Did you check only the last report, or did you check it the way the lenses change throughout the year?
Yes, that's what we're doing. So we're doing it. We did it once for the 2014 report, and then we did it again, the 2023 report, and we'll be showing you the changes.
Changes concerning the different three lenses?
Yes.
How it developed, how
Yep.
it changed?
That's right. That's where we're going. So in fact, let's go there. So what you have here is, it looks like a lot, but work with me. The blue is, all the blue lines are describing the data that, over here it's frequencies and over there it's percentage changes over the two panels, okay? And the blue are from the 2014, and the orange, if you're colorblind, it's blue, orange, okay? And then blue, orange. So Amir's colorblind, so when I show this to Amir, I have to point. Okay, and so that you're seeing the numerical change there. And what we've got here is purely technical comments, purely behavioral comments, purely normative comments. Comments that are both technical and behavioral. Comments that are both technical and normative. Comments that are behavioral and normative. And comments that are all three. Now, not surprisingly, most comments in an IPCC report are technical, right? But there are big changes going on proportionately. And the changes are especially changes that are towards being more cognitively complex. And in particular, changes that are including a normative aspect. This is the moral shift. Right, so there's this surge of there's still technical comments or behavioral comments, but they're also putting a moral, this is right versus wrong, on top of it. So let's talk about the importance of a moral shift. From the psychological perspective, the use of a moral construal is important because it is motivating for humans. The psychologists in the audience are probably making the distinction between a cold cognition and a hot cognition. Right? A cold cognition is simply the facts. A hot cognition is the facts with meaning that you care about. Once we make a moral claim, that's when fists are pounded and the blood boils and the family discussion becomes difficult. Right? or at least emotionally interesting. If you're the outside, right? Yeah. So it's not just about having turkey, it's about, right? And it's incredibly motivating, which is getting back to where I apply this. You go back to the applications. If you're just going to work, that's one thing. I'm an accountant at a company. Who can get excited about that? Sorry, accountants. Right? But if I'm an accountant at a company that's changing the world, now I'm motivated, right? Be the idea.
What is one comment?
What is one comment?
Yeah, like how do you define it? Is it just...
So it would be, a comment would be somebody goes in and says, these are examples of them, right? Somebody goes in and makes a comment on something that happened, they actually write it in, and it says, the concept of a climactic impact driver is a new addition to the AR6 cycle. And we believe, blah, 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 right?
Yeah, but you can write a comment that has different parts. Like, how do you say that one comment has more than one?
One
commenter
commenter can make more than one comment.
That's right. So this one, for example, makes a technical claim here, even though it's making a moral claim there. And so some will say, so let's say, for example, I'm making this one up, but it's easy to do. Companies have found it profitable to use low-quality plastics for packaging beverages. Now that's a behavioral claim about the behavior of firms. This is especially true in poor countries like the Philippines, where the people are consequentially suffering from a massive amount of plastic pollution. And you go to Palawan, beautiful Palawan, and there's plastic everywhere, right? So that was a normative statement, a moral statement. It was also a comment or a statement that was behavioral. The low-quality plastics part is actually technically important because we know that that's not biodegradable and it's only
That's
downside.
clear, but in your research, will you call it a complex comment? That's my question.
Yes, so that one would have been called T, B, and
Okay, so you
M.
take the whole comment
Yep.
and then you grade it. You don't
Yes.
separate it. This is moral. This.
No. I take the whole comment. That's good. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, just going back to your to the results.
Yeah, let me go back there. Okay.
Because I want to try and understand. So, what I'm seeing is that apparently over time, the percentage of technical comments more or less stays the same, whereas interestingly, the behavioral comments and the normative comments have gone down. Which I'm trying to understand, why is it then that people are, in fact, according to the rest of the chart, thinking in more complex thoughts? In other words, people seem to have shifted from perhaps, we don't know if it's not the same people necessarily, but shifted from normative thinking and behavioral thinking purely to more complex is it?
Yeah, that's fair to say. And just to get at what David's getting at here, he's contrasting this with this. This is not a statistically significant change. It's essentially no change that outside of what would be random. This is barely statistically significant, but it is statistically significant negative. And of course, it's hard not to be statistically significant when your n is a gazillion, but right, because the denominator in the test. But you can see where the change is happening. Now, we don't know if that would continue. As time goes on and we get more of these panels, then we would know if that would continue. Yes, go ahead.
You only conscious the 2014 and 2023 reports, correct?
Yes.
Would it not be good actually to go back in time and
Yes.
actually look at the others? Because
Yes.
then you have a trend line that would show how all of this was
Yes.
changing. Because when I look at those comments over there,
Yes.
what I'm also seeing is that the complex arguments, it's almost like they're trying to sell the technical. They have to keep the technical in there because these are RTC reports. They're scientific.
Yes.
They're going out to a scientific audience. but it would also, as time goes on, the science is being fixed.
Yeah.
In other words, there isn't much more they can do in terms of establishing that from a scientific basis, we have a problem, and this is what is happening, and this same trend is going on. But in order to sell, literally, the moral and the other, they have to tie it up in scientific language, because it's never going to work if you take that out of there.
Right.
So
right,
that's
right.
why it's combined with the other
Yes.
elements of it.
Yeah, I think that may actually be what's going on. The process you're describing, what's your first name there? I'm trying
Jeff.
Okay, Jeff. Yeah, the process you're describing, Jeff, is a very intentional process. You know, people are unfortunately not often so intentional about their construals. But if you were going to be strategic here, you would do exactly what you're saying, right? But it could also happen almost inadvertently, right? There's not much more to add. Although my climate scientist friends tell me that the field is young, right? And of course, we're having a debate at the school, because everybody else thinks, well, we know everything we need to know about climate change, and they're appalled because, you know, that's like the person in the American Patent Office in the year 1900 who said, oh, we're done with all the inventions, right? And so it may be that the field is not young, but you are describing basically what could well be going on here. Regardless, we certainly are having an increase in the numbers. Let's get to this issue of whether it's in the global. We'll get to that. What did I put here? This just combines. This just combines the normative and the non-normative. So this is already what came out of it. So here's the increase in normative versus the increase in non-normative, and that just reminds you of what the percentages look like there. Now here's where we get to your global north and global south comparison that we've had some, you know, right, if you start looking at this. So the way to disentangle this is that here's you've got global south numbers, global north numbers, global south relative proportional change, global north relative proportional change. And so what you've got is the global south saw growth in participation generally. So they didn't have they had fewer, but now they have more comments. Compared to but it still remains small compared to the global north, which is not surprising.
How small?
Pardon me?
How small? What is the difference between?
Well, the actual difference is the numerical comparison here, where this axis maxes out at 5,000. That axis maxes out at 40,000. Okay, so the global north, but of course the global north, it includes Europe, it includes, the global north includes Israel, for example, the United States. So just in terms of rates of literacy, rates of
internet access.
Yeah, I was going to say proliferation of the technologies required to make this and so forth. You'd expect that there to be differences, development, level of development, economic development. But you do see multi-lens thinking, construals, increasing both in the global north and the global south. Specifically, if you just get at this issue of normative, both groups became more normative. So here we have, this is broken out by, that's the AR5 is 2014, AR6 is 2023. And you're seeing a comparison now where blue is global north and orange is global south. Okay, and so both groups became and this is a proportionate change. So both groups became more normative, a proportionate increase in normative, right? If this is global south and this is global north. Global north even grew more, and that's a statistically significant increase than the global south, although the global south is still more normative overall than the global north. So those who are experiencing the consequences of climate change, which is largely the global south, are much more normative in their commentaries about climate change, which is what you would expect from the psychology literature that shows that once you've experienced the impact of something connected to climate change, you become more moral and normative about your arguments, about your interpretive lens in understanding it.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One technical is in the previous slide, you showed that both the global north and global south, there's an increase in the normative, only normative comments, but previously we showed that there's a decrease. Overall, there was a decrease in normative. So, is there another group that is missing, the one that is not known?
The overall increase in normative.
Yeah, it did increase in normative. So it's the exact same data. So
if you take it, so here you have an increase, but if you take 2 slides back, there's a decrease in normative.
yeah, so what happens here is this is a big increase. So this includes normatives.
No, I'm talking about just normatives.
Yeah. So what we do when we go with the breakout of normative versus non-normative is that groups together N, TN, BN, NTBN. Right. So it's an aggregation of those categories that have any normative, but also have behavioral and technical.
So the more important question, maybe not important, but you give very, I think, positive spin to the increase in normative comments, the attitude.
Yes.
Answers. But could it be that, with time, these years, we see the really increase in argumentative, even bots that you just would just argue
Sure.
for case for the
Yeah, that's a good
argument,
point.
etc., which
Sure.
can be seen as normative. It says this is wrong, this is right.
Yeah.
This is,
Yeah, so it could also be bots. It could, although they would need to be at this point very sophisticated bots. It wouldn't rule it out, but in order to go in and make the comments, the IPCC folks have been concerned about that. So there's a lot of checks on whether you're.
But not even bots, just opinionated approach, regardless of the, it's a moral motivation.
Yes.
Motivation is basically just to disagree or agree.
That's a great point. So
Oded, it's far. Oded.
Bart?
Oded.
Oded. Okay, thank you, Oded. So Oded makes a great point here. So we do have an issue that's going on in discourse, that it becomes polarized, especially around climate change. Doug Gilboa, one of the professors at the business school at Stanford, who's a rock star in computational social science. I've learned a lot from Doug. He and Amir do a lot of work together. He and Amir Goldberg. So Doug has this very interesting paper with Dave Santola and some other people where they take discourse around climate change and find that if the discourse around climate change is purely around the phenomena, now he doesn't use the technical behavioral language I'm talking about. The paper came out several years ago, but in going back and rereading that paper of his from 2022, I think what he's getting at is when it's purely about the phenomena means it's technical and behavioral. It's quite constructive. That kind of discourse leads to convergence on the truth. When that discourse is primed by political affiliation, it becomes ignorant, polarizing, and people do not converge on the truth. He runs these very interesting experiments. And so you could have, and you're exactly right, I'm guilty of being excited about the normative trend. I guess it showed. I'm trying to act like I'm not excited, but I am. But in fact, this could be people who are yelling past one another, like at the, she's gone to the family event, I guess. But who are yelling past each other at whatever your holiday of choice is, right? And at that point, there's no growth in the. Now, one of the things we're going to be looking at next is whether or not the consequence, I was hoping, I asked Shobana, she's been working furiously to get results by now, so that I could tell you, and nothing in my email. So what I want to look at is we know whether or not IPCC authors accept the argument and change what they've done, reject the argument, or choose to ignore the argument. They say, noted. Don't you hate it when people say that, when you get the one word back in an email? Noted. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not, in fact, the moral arguments are more effective or not. And I obviously am thinking they're going to be, but it may be that they're not. Yes, please.
This justifies your next lecture at the meeting.
Yes, everything always is that way in research, right? I mean, that's the...
Are you extracting keywords, for example, in the comments? So, for example, in the last 10 years, I would say that the whole concept of just transition, social justice has become very, very associated to climate change. And that could be one of the reasons why we are transitioning more to a more moral aspect of looking at climate change in general.
Yes.
And also, specifically, climate change has become so political that it's also becoming more of an emotional aspect to it to a certain level and less scientific. So I'm just interested if you also
That's a very good question.
recognize keywords.
Yeah, so we don't hear, but the reason keywords, because you can imagine somebody coming back and saying, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay, great. So you can imagine somebody coming back at this and saying, why not just look at keywords instead of all this work you do to get the machine to identify moral? It's because we want to see moral arguments, even the ones that don't use keywords. Where keywords come into play is that they become hot buttons. And as soon as they roll off somebody's tongue, the other side now completely understands this as a polarized discussion, right? And we've all experienced this in life, right? Where the very second something comes rolling off your tongue, the other side now sees it, and they've marked you in terms of an identity and a position, and they're going to respond to that.
But additionally to, not one instead of the other, but one next to the other?
Yes. Yeah, and we hadn't thought of doing that, but I'm thinking that would be a good move, right? That would be a good direction to go in. I don't know if I want Shobana to make that move. She wants to finish her dissertation. But I do think it's a good thing. Now I've got several hands. What I'm going to do is finish. And then ask for permission to see if we can keep going. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. There's no great, this is the last slide, but it's, but I do want to drive home the point here is that the Global South still maintains a level of normative. They're twice as likely as the Global North to take a moral construal in making sense out of climate change. The Global North is still largely seeing this as an instrumental issue, but that is changing. At least it was changing between 2024 and 2014, 2024, 2023. But the argument I want to get back to is that the opening question is that we want to get at how humanity is making sense of climate change without falling into simply documenting the hype cycle. You want to look at the deeper currents. Changes in construals happen more slowly. We know this more generally. They happen much more slowly than changes in position. Changes in position come and go. That's the fads and fashions point that I opened with. Changes in construals require the creation, which is a process of social construction, the creation of cognitive schema that makes sense of the world. And at least as far as this particular corpus is concerned, we are seeing an increase in both more complex construals and more normative or moral construals. When it comes to catalyzing behavior, you would see that as a good thing. It might also be a bad thing with respect to polarization. So, what do I got?
Yeah, you got, 2 minutes we got. So.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes for questions, and I'm going to favor people who haven't yet answered a question or asked a question, and that would include you. So go ahead.
I was just wondering if your wider goal is to kind of see how people perceive like climate change and that issue into these three grids. Then
yes.
Isn't there a little bit, or do you address some kind of maybe by looking at this sample, which is people who are initially interested in it, they're aware of this option to comment, or even this report in general, or education and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'm looking at enthusiasts, and the question is, would we want to look at everybody, or would we want to look at enthusiasts? And I did think about this at first, because, there is the question, I could imagine, I remember I was out in the middle of Arizona, and I went to a place called Pie Town. And they have one store, and they sell pies. And I go in there, and it's Trump City. And they see me walk in, and immediately start. Anyway, it was, I just came for the pie. So I got a pie. My daughter was with me. She refused to eat a Trump pie, right? And do I want those folks in my data? Like, should I have everybody in the data? And what I chose to do was to go in the direction of the subset of the world population that potentially could be the change makers, because we are going to change. We are. Because the counterfactual is to not change, which if we continue to not change, because we're essentially not changing, we will see an even stronger reaction by Earth, which will ultimately catalyze change at some point. The question isn't whether we change. It's how many more millions of people will suffer and die before we change. That's really the question. And so my underlying objective as a social scientist is to understand what we need to understand to make proactive change to a sustainable world real. Right? If you look at my generation, in the 20th century, we gave the world mass production and consumption. In fact, business schools were a big part of that. In the 21st century, your generation will be the greatest generation, because you will give the world sustainable production and consumption. And that's not going to come from the folks in Pie Town. And I know I sound just as elite as Hillary Clinton when I say that, but so be it, because the children of the folks in Pie Town will live if we succeed, right? And that's what I'm aiming at. So thank you very much. It's been an honor.